In the aftermath of the Great War, Europe was a continent bleeding from its own wounds. Germany lay broken, its empire shattered, its pride humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles. Poverty spread like a sickness. Veterans wandered the streets, angry and disillusioned. And in that bitterness, one man found his voice, Adolf Hitler, a failed artist from Austria, a soldier of the Great War, and a man consumed by hatred and ambition, began to shape a message that would seduce a broken nation. Hitler joined the small German Workers' Party in 1919. It was insignificant, just a handful of nationalists meeting in beer halls. But Hitler had something none of them did, the gift of speech. When he spoke, rooms grew still. His voice was sharp, furious, hypnotic. He could turn despair into rage, and rage into loyalty. By 1920, the German Workers' Party became the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. Their symbol, the swastika, ancient and powerful, became a banner of revenge. Germany's economy collapsed again in 1923. Inflation spiraled out of control. The cost of bread could double between sunrise and sunset. People burned banknotes for warmth. Amid this chaos, Hitler saw his chance. He attempted to seize power, a coup later known as the Beer Hall Putsch, but it failed. 16 Nazis were killed. Hitler was arrested and charged with treason, yet prison didn't silence him. It amplified him. In his cell at Landsberg, Hitler dictated a book, Mein Kampf, half autobiography, half blueprint for domination. Inside its pages, he promised revenge against the Allies, destruction of the Jews, and the creation of a racially pure empire, the Third Reich. Few outside Germany took notice. The world was tired of war and dismissed him as another fanatic. But time would prove them wrong. When Hitler left prison, he was a man transformed. No longer a street agitator, but a strategist. He decided that power would not be taken by force, but through the system itself. He rebuilt the Nazi Party, forming alliances with industrialists, nationalists, and the frightened middle class. Then came the Great Depression. In 1929, the world economy collapsed again. Millions of Germans lost their jobs. Democracy seemed useless, and Hitler's voice, that angry, confident, vengeful voice, filled the void. By 1932, the Nazis were the largest political party in Germany. And in January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Within months, democracy was dead. The Reichstag burned, political opponents were jailed, and Hitler declared himself Führer, the supreme leader. Germany was reborn, not as a republic, but as a dictatorship. The first mistake was not Hitler's. It was the world's for underestimating him. Hitler's new Germany moved with frightening speed. Massive public works projects revived the economy. The Autobahn stretched across the nation. Unemployment vanished. For the first time in years, Germans felt proud again. But beneath that illusion of prosperity lay terror. The Gestapo watched every whisper. The concentration camps at Dachau and Buchenwald filled with political prisoners. Jews were banned from public service, stripped of rights, and humiliated in the streets. Propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels built an empire of lies, films, radio, and newspapers that glorified Hitler and demonized his enemies. The Nazi regime became a machine powered by fear and fanaticism. In 1936, Germany hosted the Olympic Games in Berlin. The world came to see the new Germany, modern, disciplined, unstoppable. But behind the grand stadiums and smiling faces, Hitler was preparing for war. The Rhineland was remilitarized in violation of the Versailles Treaty. Britain and France protested, but did nothing. To Hitler, this confirmed a dangerous belief that his enemies lacked the will to fight. He would test that theory again and again. From the ashes of the Great War, Hitler had built a new German war machine. Tanks, planes, and ships produced in secret, now displayed with pride. The Wehrmacht was ready. The Luftwaffe soared through the skies. But more than weapons, Hitler had created something far more dangerous, a nation that believed it was invincible. He stood before the crowds, his voice echoing across the Nuremberg rallies. "Today Germany, tomorrow the world." The people roared. No one could have imagined that those words would soon ignite the deadliest conflict in human history. As Europe slept, Hitler sharpened his ambitions. His first targets were small: the Saarland, the Rhineland, then Austria, Czechoslovakia, and finally Poland. Each move was a gamble. Each victory fed his delusion of destiny. But history would soon show that these gambles would become his greatest mistakes. Europe in the late 1930s was a continent haunted by ghosts. The memory of the Great War still lingered in every home, a generation of fathers and sons buried beneath foreign soil. No one wanted to believe that it could happen again, and Adolf Hitler knew it. He understood fear, not only how to inspire it, but how to exploit it. His next move would not be made with bullets, but with words. In 1938, Hitler turned his gaze south to Austria, the country of his birth. For years, Austrian Nazis had agitated for unification with Germany. They called it the Anschluss, the joining. Hitler framed it as destiny. He claimed that all Germans belonged under one flag. The Austrian government hesitated. But when German troops crossed the border in March 1938, there was no resistance. Crowds lined the streets of Vienna cheering. Flowers covered the tanks. It was bloodless, a conquest without war. To the world, it seemed like a reunion. To Hitler, it was the first step in his grand design, a greater German Reich stretching across Europe. But his ambitions did not stop there. To the east lay Czechoslovakia, a democratic nation born from the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Within its borders was the Sudetenland, home to millions of ethnic Germans. Hitler demanded it. He claimed these Germans were oppressed, mistreated by the Czech government. His propaganda machine spread lies and staged incidents of abuse. Europe once again faced the specter of war. But this time, instead of standing up to Hitler, Britain and France sought to appease him. In September 1938, leaders gathered in Munich. Adolf Hitler, Neville Chamberlain of Britain, Edouard Daladier of France, and Benito Mussolini of Italy. Czechoslovakia was not even invited. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, threatening war if denied. The others, desperate to avoid bloodshed, gave in. They signed the Munich Agreement, handing over the territory in exchange for a promise, Hitler's promise, of peace. When Chamberlain returned to London, he stood before the cheering crowd and declared, "I believe it is peace for our time," but in truth, it was the opposite. The Munich Agreement marked not peace, but the death of deterrence. Hitler had learned a dangerous lesson. The democracies of Europe were unwilling to fight. Just months later, in March 1939, German tanks rolled into Prague. This time, there were no excuses, no ethnic claims, only conquest. Czechoslovakia ceased to exist. The Western powers finally saw the truth. Hitler could not be bargained with. In Berlin, the Führer was triumphant. He boasted to his generals that the British and French were worms who would never stand against him. The German people believed their leader was invincible. Factories roared with production. Steel flowed into tanks and aircraft. Youths were drafted into the Hitler Jugend, trained to die for the Reich. But behind the triumph, a few generals whispered doubts. They saw Hitler's recklessness. They saw his contempt for reality. They saw the shadow of disaster forming, even if he could not. Now, only Poland stood between Hitler and total domination of Eastern Europe. But Hitler faced a problem. If he invaded Poland, Britain and France had sworn to defend it. He needed to neutralize them, or at least delay their response, and so he made a move no one expected. On August 23, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression treaty between two sworn enemies. In secret, the pact included a hidden protocol. Germany and the USSR would divide Eastern Europe between them. Poland would be split in half. Stalin would take the East, Hitler, the West. The world was stunned. How could the sworn enemies of communism and fascism suddenly embrace? The answer was simple: greed and fear. Stalin wanted time to rebuild his army after purges that had killed thousands of his own officers. Hitler wanted a free hand to strike westward without worrying about his eastern flank. At dawn on September 1st, 1939, Hitler unleashed his armies. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The concept was revolutionary: fast-moving tank divisions, mechanized infantry, and air power working in perfect coordination. Within hours, Polish defenses collapsed. Stuka dive bombers screamed from the sky. Tanks roared through villages. Civilians fled in terror. The world had not seen warfare like this. Swift, brutal, precise. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. Poland fought bravely but was outmatched. Within weeks, the country was carved apart. Germany from the west, the Soviet Union from the east. Warsaw fell on September 27th. The Polish government fled into exile, and Hitler, standing at the height of his power, believed that destiny itself was on his side. But in his arrogance, he failed to see the truth. By invading Poland, he had awoken the very powers he sought to avoid. The war he started would not be quick, nor easy, and it would consume everything he built. In the West, the world braced itself. Britain mobilized, France fortified, and yet for months there was silence. A strange calm settled over Europe. Soldiers waited, nations held their breath. Historians would later call it the phony war. But Hitler was already planning his next strike, a strike that would shatter that calm and plunge the continent into chaos once more. The world had changed overnight. The invasion of Poland marked the end of illusions. Europe was once again at war, a war unlike any before it. In the east, Polish cities burned. In the west, Britain and France prepared for the storm they had hoped would never come. But for several months, the front remained silent. This was the phony war, a strange pause before the storm. The Allied armies stood behind the Maginot Line, a massive fortress system along the French border. It was an engineering marvel, miles of tunnels, bunkers, and heavy guns. France believed it was impregnable. Soldiers played cards, wrote letters, and waited. Across the border, the German army did not wait. It planned. Hitler's generals refined the tactics that had crushed Poland. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, speed, shock, surprise, a strategy built not on brute strength, but on coordination, tanks, aircraft, and radio communication striking in unison. By the spring of 1940, Hitler was ready to move. But before turning west, he needed to secure his northern flank. His eyes turned toward Scandinavia. On April 9, 1940, German forces launched Operation Weserübung, the invasion of Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell within hours. Its army was small, resistance futile. But Norway, strategic for its ports and access to iron ore, became a fierce battleground. The British and French attempted to intervene, landing troops in Narvik and Trondheim. For a brief moment, it seemed the Allies might score their first victory, but German air superiority crushed them. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, bombing Allied ships and cutting supply lines. Within weeks, Norway fell. The invasion was another stunning success for Hitler. His confidence soared, and with it, his arrogance. Yet the victory carried an unseen cost. The Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy, suffered heavy losses. Those losses would haunt Hitler years later when he tried to challenge Britain across the sea. Still, in the spring of 1940, the world stood in awe. Every gamble seemed to pay off. Every move made Hitler appear invincible. And so, he turned to his ultimate prize. France had the largest army in Europe. It was well-equipped, well-trained, and backed by the powerful British Expeditionary Force. But its generals fought the last war, not the next one. They expected Germany to attack through Belgium. Just as in 1914, they planned to rush their armies north to meet them. Hitler, however, had a different plan. His generals, particularly Erich von Manstein, proposed a daring strategy. Instead of striking only through Belgium, the main assault would go through the Ardennes forest, a region considered impassable for tanks. It was a masterstroke. While the Allies moved north, German armored divisions, led by Heinz Guderian, sliced through the Ardennes and reached the Meuse River. In 3 days, they broke through. By May 20th, German tanks had reached the English Channel, trapping the Allied armies in Belgium. The British and French forces were surrounded. Defeat seemed inevitable, but in the chaos, one of history's most extraordinary evacuations began. May 26, 1940. Hundreds of thousands of British and French troops trapped on the beaches, pinned down by German fire, desperate for rescue. Then came a decision that would define Hitler's war. He halted his tanks, for reasons still debated, whether arrogance, exhaustion, or the desire to spare his armored units. Hitler ordered his forces to stop. He believed the Luftwaffe could finish the job, but the weather turned. Clouds and storms grounded the German planes. Across the Channel, Britain launched Operation Dynamo, an improvised evacuation of staggering scale. Navy destroyers, fishing boats, and civilian vessels crossed the sea under fire, ferrying men from the beaches. Over 9 days, more than 330,000 soldiers escaped. Winston Churchill called it a miracle of deliverance. The British army was saved, battered, but alive. To Hitler, Dunkirk was a victory. France was collapsing. He believed sparing the British army might encourage peace talks. It was his second great mistake. The men who escaped Dunkirk would one day return on the beaches of Normandy. By June 10th, Italy had joined the war, Mussolini eager to share in Hitler's triumphs. 4 days later, Paris was declared an open city. German troops marched down the Champs-Élysées. The world watched in disbelief. In less than 6 weeks, France, a great power of Europe, had fallen. The French government surrendered on June 22, 1940. In the same railway carriage where Germany had signed its own surrender in 1918, Hitler stood triumphant. It was symbolic revenge, a humiliation for France, a moment of glory for the Reich. Hitler's empire now stretched from the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees. Only Britain remained. And in his mind, the war was nearly won. But Hitler's confidence blinded him. He believed Britain would seek peace, that they would never fight alone. He was wrong. Across the Channel, Winston Churchill's voice thundered through the airwaves. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender." Hitler listened and smiled. He admired Churchill's defiance, but he also underestimated it. His next move would determine the fate of Europe and expose one of his greatest fatal errors. He would attempt the impossible, to break Britain, not with armies, but with air power. The Battle of Britain was about to begin. Summer 1940, France had fallen. Europe lay under Nazi control. From the Arctic to the Mediterranean, Hitler's banners flew triumphantly. Only one nation remained defiant: the island fortress of Great Britain. Across the Channel, the British Empire stood alone. No allies, no continental army. Only the English Channel separated them from invasion. Hitler believed the war was already over. He called it Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. But before his troops could land, one obstacle stood in his way: the Royal Air Force. The Luftwaffe had crushed every air force it faced. Hitler was certain Britain would fall in weeks. He told his generals, "We will destroy the British Air Force like a chicken in its shell." But he underestimated two things: British resilience and radar. On July 10, 1940, the Battle of Britain began. German bombers crossed the Channel in massive formations, escorted by swarms of Messerschmitt fighters. Their goal: destroy the RAF on the ground, bomb the airfields, cripple radar, and prepare for invasion. Britain's defense relied on fewer than 1,000 fighter planes, the Spitfires and Hurricanes, and a network of radar stations that gave early warning of incoming raids. Day after day, the skies above England burned. Dogfights erupted over the coast, the countryside, and the cities. Pilots as young as 19 soared into combat, knowing that one mistake meant death. The RAF was outnumbered, but they had an advantage: home soil, shorter refueling times, and radar, a secret weapon the Germans never fully understood. The Luftwaffe, frustrated by slow progress, shifted targets. Instead of airfields, they began bombing London. On September 7, 1940, Hitler unleashed the Blitz, a bombing campaign meant to crush British morale. Night after night, the skies turned red. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Civilians took shelter in the underground, singing to drown out the thunder above. Children were evacuated from cities to the countryside. The world watched, expecting Britain to break. But Britain did not break. In the face of destruction, the nation's spirit hardened. Churchill's words echoed through the airwaves. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. By October, the RAF had regained control of the skies. German losses mounted. The invasion was postponed, then quietly abandoned. The Battle of Britain was Hitler's first major defeat. He had assumed that sheer force could break a nation's will. Instead, he discovered that courage, discipline, and faith could defy even his mightiest armies. But the failure did not humble him. It enraged him, and in that anger, he made another fatal decision, one that would turn victory into disaster. He turned east, toward the vast lands of the Soviet Union. It would become his greatest gamble, and his greatest mistake. June 22nd, 1941. Dawn breaks over Eastern Europe. The sky glows faintly pink as more than 3 million German soldiers stand poised along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Engines hum. Horses snort. Artillery creaks in the morning mist. At precisely 3:15 a.m., the silence shatters. Artillery roars. Bombers rise into the air. Columns of tanks thunder across the border. Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in human history, has begun. Hitler's armies surge eastward into the Soviet Union. It is a campaign of staggering ambition, born of arrogance and hatred. Hitler's decision to attack the Soviet Union was not simply strategic, it was ideological. For years, he had written of his dream for Lebensraum, living space, for the German people. He saw the vast plains of Russia as his destiny, its people as slaves to his empire. But behind this grand illusion lay a dangerous miscalculation. Hitler believed that the Soviet Union was weak, a colossus with feet of clay. He thought the Red Army had been crippled by Stalin's purges, that one swift strike would bring it crashing down. He was wrong. In the early days, the invasion seemed unstoppable. The Wehrmacht advanced with terrifying speed. Soviet divisions were encircled, crushed, and captured by the hundreds of thousands. Entire armies vanished. German tanks, the Panzer divisions, raced across the plains. Cities like Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev fell in rapid succession. German soldiers believed the war would be over by Christmas. Hitler boasted that the Soviet Union would collapse like a house of cards. But beneath the victories, cracks were forming. The vast distances, poor roads, and endless mud slowed the German advance. Supply lines stretched thin. Fuel ran low. And yet Hitler pushed onward, toward his ultimate prize, Moscow. By October 1941, German troops were within sight of Moscow. The Soviet capital was under siege. The German High Command called it Operation Typhoon, the final push. But nature itself rose against them. Autumn rains turned the roads into rivers of mud. Vehicles sank. Horses died in the mire. Then came the winter, the coldest in decades. German soldiers froze in their summer uniforms, their weapons jammed by ice. The Wehrmacht, once unstoppable, now struggled to survive. In December, the Red Army launched a massive counterattack. Fresh divisions from Siberia, hardened by the cold, struck with fury. German lines buckled. Moscow did not fall. Hitler's grand gamble had failed. For the first time, the myth of invincibility cracked. But Hitler refused to see it. He dismissed his generals' warnings, forbade retreats, and replaced seasoned officers with loyal fanatics. He declared, "We will stand fast, or we will die." His decisions condemned hundreds of thousands to death. As winter deepened, soldiers froze in foxholes. Fuel ran out. Food dwindled. The dead lay unburied, their bodies frozen where they fell. The Germans were not just fighting the Red Army now. They were fighting the land itself. And behind the front, something far darker was unfolding. Operation Barbarossa was not only a military campaign, it was a war of annihilation. Following behind the army were the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads sent to eliminate Jews, communists, and undesirables. In towns and villages across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics, mass executions began. Entire communities were destroyed. Men, women, and children were rounded up and shot into open pits. The Holocaust had begun, not in the gas chambers of Auschwitz, but here in the fields of Eastern Europe. This was Hitler's true crime. He turned war into genocide, and in doing so, he sealed his fate. The brutality of Barbarossa would unite the Soviet people and harden their will to resist. Instead of collapsing, the Soviet Union became a monster awakened, vast, vengeful, and unstoppable. The Eastern Front was no longer a campaign. It was a struggle for survival, one that would consume millions. By early 1942, the German advance had stalled. Hitler refused to retreat, refused to regroup. He told his commanders, "Moscow will fall, or we will all fall with it." But the truth was clear. The Red Army was learning. Soviet industry, relocated deep into the Urals, was producing tanks and weapons faster than Germany could destroy them. The Luftwaffe's dominance faded. German soldiers, once hunters, were now being hunted. Still, Hitler believed he could win the war with one decisive blow. If Moscow could not be taken, then perhaps the oil fields of the south, the Caucasus, and the Volga city of Stalingrad would bring victory. It would become the next great chapter of his downfall. In the east, the snow melted and the fields turned red. Hitler prepared for another offensive, one that would change the course of the war forever. By mid-1942, the tide of war was beginning to shift. Germany still controlled most of Europe, but the illusion of invincibility was crumbling. The failed conquest of Moscow had left the Wehrmacht bloodied and exhausted. And yet, Hitler refused to accept the limits of his power. He looked again to the east, to the wide, oil-rich lands of the Caucasus. If he could seize the oil fields of Baku, he reasoned, the Reich would never run dry. Fuel would power his tanks, his planes, his war machine. But one city stood in the way, a city that would become the symbol of defiance and destruction. In the summer of 1942, Hitler launched Operation Blue, a renewed assault into southern Russia. German divisions stormed eastward once again, driving toward the Volga River. But as they advanced, Hitler made a fatal change in strategy. He divided his forces, one army toward the oil fields, another toward Stalingrad. It was a decision born of pride and obsession. Stalingrad bore the name of his enemy, Joseph Stalin. To Hitler, capturing it would be both strategic and symbolic. But in chasing both goals at once, he fatally weakened his strength. In August 1942, the Luftwaffe unleashed a firestorm upon Stalingrad. Thousands of tons of bombs rained down. The city turned to rubble, and yet, amid the ruins, the Soviets refused to surrender. Street by street, house by house, basement by basement, they fought. The Germans soon discovered they were trapped in a nightmare of close combat. Snipers hunted in shadows. Grenades shattered stairwells. Fighting took place inside burned-out factories and beneath the ground in sewers. It was, as one German officer described, a city of death. By October, the German Sixth Army had captured most of the city, but the Soviets still held a sliver of land by the river. their lifeline. Across the Volga, reinforcements poured in under constant bombardment. Winter arrived, and with it, the trap. In November 1942, the Red Army struck back, codenamed Operation Uranus. It was a masterstroke of deception and coordination. Soviet forces attacked the weaker flanks of the German line, manned by Romanian and Hungarian troops. Within days, the encirclement was complete. The entire German Sixth Army, over 300,000 men, was trapped inside Stalingrad. Hitler ordered them to hold their ground. He promised resupply by air, but the Luftwaffe could deliver only a fraction of what was needed. Men starved. Ammunition ran out. Frostbite and disease spread through the frozen ruins, and still, Hitler refused to allow surrender. By January 1943, the Sixth Army was dying. Its commander, General Friedrich Paulus, begged for permission to break out. Hitler denied it. Then, on January 31st, Paulus surrendered. 2 days later, the remaining forces followed. Of the 300,000 who entered Stalingrad, fewer than 100,000 survived captivity. Stalingrad was not just a defeat, it was a catastrophe, a psychological and military turning point. For the first time, the world saw that Hitler could be beaten. While the snows of Stalingrad buried one German army, another fought under the blazing sun of North Africa. Here, the legendary Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had waged a brilliant campaign. His Africa Corps had pushed the British deep into Egypt. Cairo seemed within reach, but in October 1942, at the small railway stop of El Alamein, the tide changed. British General Bernard Montgomery, leading the Eighth Army, launched a massive offensive. The battle raged for 12 days. Tanks clashed in sandstorms. Artillery shook the desert. When the smoke cleared, Rommel's army was in retreat. It was Hitler's first major loss against the Western Allies. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." The myth of Nazi invincibility was shattered, first in the snows of Stalingrad, then in the sands of Egypt. On December 7, 1941, even before Stalingrad and El Alamein, the course of history had shifted dramatically. Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into the war. The next day, Hitler declared war on America, another of his fatal mistakes. He underestimated the industrial and military power of the United States. In months, American factories roared to life, producing tanks, planes, ships, and supplies on a scale the world had never seen. By 1943, the U.S. was not just aiding Britain and the Soviets, it was leading a global alliance. The arsenal of democracy was now fully armed. From the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of the Pacific, Allied power was rising. Germany's enemies were... He interfered constantly with his generals, making decisions driven by ego rather than strategy. He demanded his troops hold every inch of ground, no matter the cost. He replaced rational command with delusion. Instead of adapting, he doubled down. And so in 1943, Germany's once unstoppable machine began to collapse under its own weight. Every victory turned to dust. Every advance became a retreat. In early 1943, Allied forces landed in North Africa. By May, the German and Italian armies surrendered there completely. The Mediterranean was now an Allied lake. The Soviets advanced westward from Stalingrad, reclaiming land mile by mile. In the skies above Germany, American and British bombers now struck by day and night, burning cities and crippling industry. Hitler raged in his bunker at the Wolf's Lair, blaming his generals, his allies, and fate, everyone but himself. His dream of empire was crumbling, but he still believed in one final victory. He would make one last gamble, one last great offensive, to turn the tide once more. The world would soon know it as the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history. At Stalingrad, Hitler lost an army. At El Alamein, he lost a continent. At Pearl Harbor, he gained an enemy he could never defeat. And yet, He still believed destiny was on his side. By 1943, Adolf Hitler's empire had reached its peak and begun its slow collapse. The dreams of world domination that once seemed within his grasp were now fading in fire and ruin. The victories of 1939, 1940, and 1941 had given way to the brutal, grinding reality of a war Germany could no longer win. Hitler had gambled everything, and now the bills of war were coming due. In the East, the Red Army was reborn. No longer the broken force of 1941, it was now disciplined, organized, and armed with vast quantities of tanks, guns, and men. Factories deep within the Soviet Union, in the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia, poured out weapons day and night, and the Soviets had learned. They had adapted to German tactics. They had mastered deception, counteroffensives, and coordination. Their goal was simple: to drive the invaders from their land and push onward to Berlin. Hitler, however, refused to see it. He believed that one more decisive battle could turn the tide. One last strike could crush the Soviet advance and restore his fading glory. He chose his battlefield carefully: the city of Kursk. In July 1943, the fields around Kursk erupted into chaos. More than 6,000 tanks, 2 million soldiers, and 4,000 aircraft clashed in a single, titanic confrontation. It was the largest tank battle in human history. Hitler called it Operation Citadel, his final decisive blow against the Red Army. But the Soviets knew he was coming. They had prepared for months, digging miles of trenches, laying millions of mines, and building deep defensive belts. When the German panzers charged, they met a wall of fire. Soviet anti-tank guns blazed, the sky filled with smoke and flame. Entire tank divisions were reduced to burning metal. At Prokhorovka, the battle's most ferocious clash, hundreds of tanks collided at point-blank range. The ground shook like thunder, the air turned to fire, but the Germans could not break through. After just 10 days, the offensive stalled. Hitler called it off, his attention distracted by news from the Mediterranean. The Allies had landed in Sicily. Kursk was the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. From that point onward, the Germans would never again seize the initiative. The hunter had become the hunted. While Hitler's armies bled in the east, disaster struck in the south. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces, British, American, and Canadian, stormed the beaches of Sicily. German generals begged Hitler to pull back from the Eastern Front to defend the Mediterranean, but he refused. Within weeks, Sicily fell. The invasion shook the foundations of fascist Italy. Mussolini, once Hitler's proud ally, was overthrown by his own people. On September 8th, Italy surrendered to the Allies. The once mighty Axis partnership was collapsing from within. Hitler reacted with fury. German forces flooded into northern Italy, rescuing Mussolini and installing him as the puppet ruler of a new Italian social republic. But the damage was done. The southern flank of the Reich was now wide open. Allied troops advanced up the Italian peninsula, slowly, painfully, inch by inch. Rome would fall in June 1944. As the land war turned against Germany, a new front opened in the skies. By 1943, the Allied air forces had begun a relentless bombing campaign. Day and night, British and American bombers struck at German industry, cities, and morale. The Battle of the Ruhr, the bombing of Hamburg, the firestorm of Dresden, names that became synonymous with destruction. Factories were flattened. Railways were shattered. Entire neighborhoods vanished in flames. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, was now outnumbered and outgunned. Germany's cities became infernos. The population lived in bunkers, haunted by the sound of air raid sirens and the crash of falling bombs. Yet Hitler refused to change course. He dismissed the suffering of civilians as weakness. He told his ministers, if the German people cannot win this war, they do not deserve to live. The delusion was complete. By late 1943, the Red Army was advancing relentlessly. Ukraine was liberated. Kiev was retaken. The Germans were forced into a desperate retreat across hundreds of miles. Each village, each river, each hill became a battlefield. German soldiers, freezing and starving, no longer fought for victory, only survival. Stalin's armies had become unstoppable. Their numbers were vast, their resolve unbroken, and now, in the West, a new storm was gathering, one that would strike at the very heart of Hitler's empire. While Germany bled on the Eastern Front, the Western Allies planned the greatest invasion in history. From London to Washington, from Cairo to Casablanca, military leaders met to coordinate a final assault on Nazi Europe. They called it Operation Overlord. The plan: to land an Allied army on the beaches of northern France and open a second front, one that would squeeze Hitler's Reich between East and West. In England, thousands of soldiers trained for the invasion. Ports overflowed with ships and tanks. Airfields roared with the thunder of bombers. Across the Channel, the German High Command built the Atlantic Wall, a vast line of bunkers, mines, and artillery stretching from Norway to Spain. Hitler believed it was impregnable. He was wrong. By early 1944, Hitler had withdrawn almost completely from reality. He ruled from his fortified headquarters. Surrounded by maps, reports, and fear, he trusted no one. He raged against his generals, his ministers, even his allies. He believed that sheer willpower could overcome strategy and numbers, ordered impossible counterattacks, ignored the counsel of his advisors. He spoke of miracle, weapons that would change the course of the war, but the miracles never came. The Führer of 1939, confident, ruthless, commanding, had become a paranoid recluse, commanding ghosts. And outside his walls, the armies of the free world were closing in, from the beaches of Normandy to the forests of Belarus, from Rome to the skies above Berlin. The world was converging upon the heart of Nazi power. In the months ahead, everything Hitler had built would collapse, brick by brick, city by city, lie by lie. The Third Reich, once envisioned as an empire to last 1,000 years, was entering its final act. The storm was coming. The world would never be the same again. It is the night of June 5, 1944. Across the southern coast of England, the greatest armada in human history waits for dawn. Hundreds of thousands of men, Americans, British, Canadians, and others, stand ready. They are young, exhausted, afraid, but they are united by a single purpose: to free Europe from Nazi tyranny. For years, Hitler's armies have ruled the continent with iron fists. From Paris to Warsaw, from Amsterdam to Athens, the swastika has flown over conquered lands. But tonight, that reign begins to end. The operation has a name whispered in code and prayer: Overlord. Its opening assault will be known forever as D-Day. Just after midnight on June 6th, paratroopers drop from the sky over Normandy. Their parachutes bloom like white ghosts in the moonlight. They land behind enemy lines, scattered, lost but determined. Hours later, as dawn breaks, 5 beaches become the gates of history: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. The sea churns with landing craft. Shells rain from the cliffs. Machine guns rake the sand. At Omaha Beach, the slaughter is unimaginable. Waves run red. Men fall before they even touch land. But they keep coming, wave after wave, driven by duty, courage, and sheer will to survive. By nightfall, the Allies have gained a foothold. It is fragile. It is bloody, but it is real. Europe is being taken back. When reports of the invasion reach Hitler's headquarters, he refuses to believe it. He insists that Normandy is a diversion, that the real attack will come in the Pas de Calais, the shortest route across the Channel. His generals beg to release the armored divisions, but he delays for hours, waiting for confirmation that never comes. By the time the truth dawns, it is too late. Allied forces have broken through the coastal defenses and are pouring into France. It is a fatal mistake. A delay born of arrogance and disbelief, one of Hitler's final great errors. The man who once commanded Europe's armies now commands ghosts and shadows. His word still carries fear, but not wisdom. His empire, built on terror and lies, begins to crumble under the weight of its own hubris. Through June and July, the Allied armies expand their foothold. They push inland, through the hedgerows of Normandy, a maze of fields, mud, and death. The fighting is brutal. German defenses are fierce, but Allied numbers, firepower, and air dominance are overwhelming. By late July, General George S. Patton's Third Army bursts through the German lines in Operation Cobra. The breakout is unstoppable. Paris rises in rebellion. The resistance strikes from within. On August 25, 1944, French forces under General Leclerc enter the capital. The City of Light, darkened for 4 long years, shines once more. As church bells ring and flags wave, Parisians weep in the streets. The liberation is complete, but the war is far from over. By the autumn of 1944, the once mighty Wehrmacht is in full retreat. From Normandy to Belgium, from the Low Countries to the Rhine, German forces fall back under relentless assault. Hitler rages in his bunker, screaming at his generals, accusing them of betrayal. He refuses to order retreats, commanding instead that every town, every river, every street be held to the last man. But his army is exhausted, the Luftwaffe is crippled, fuel is running out, and the Allies are closing in from every direction. In the east, the Soviets advance through Poland. In the west, the Allies prepare for the final push into Germany. The war that Hitler started is now devouring him, but Hitler has one last card to play. In December 1944, he launches a surprise counterattack through the Ardennes forest, the same region he once used to outflank France in 1940. He calls it Operation Watch on the Rhine. His goal, split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. It is a desperate gamble, and at first it works. Caught off guard, the Allies reel as German tanks smash through the snow. In the fog and cold of Bastogne, American paratroopers are surrounded. When the Germans demand surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe replies with one word: nuts. The weather clears. Allied air power returns. The counterattack is crushed. Hitler's last gamble has failed. The Reich is finished. By early 1945, the Allies have crossed the Rhine. Germany's western defenses collapse. Cities lie in ruins. The once proud army now fights village to village, hopelessly outnumbered. In March, American forces free their first concentration camps, scenes of horror that defy imagination. The world begins to see the full measure of Hitler's crimes. In April, Allied and Soviet troops meet on the Elbe River. The circle is complete. From east and west, the forces of freedom close upon Berlin. Hitler's empire, built on death and delusion, is dying. Even now, in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler refuses to face reality. He blames everyone but himself, the generals, the weather, the German people. He declares that Germany has failed him. He orders the destruction of bridges, factories, even cities. His own land scorched in a final act of madness. But no order can stop what is coming. The Allies are at the gates. The Reich is burning. And the man who once ruled Europe from the Atlantic to the Volga will soon be reduced to a whisper in the dark. Berlin, 1945. The city once hailed as the heart of a 1,000-year Reich is now a broken skeleton. The streets are filled with rubble, the air thick with ash. Every wall bears scars of war. Every basement shelters ghosts. For years, Hitler had promised his people victory or annihilation. Now, that choice has come due. The Allies close in from all directions. From the west, American, British, and French armies push across the Rhine, seizing town after town. From the east, the Red Army storms through Poland, Hungary, and the ruins of East Prussia, leaving behind the vengeance of millions. The once proud Wehrmacht, shattered and exhausted, can no longer hold. What remains of its divisions are shells, teenagers, old men, and wounded soldiers called the Volkssturm, the people's militia. They carry rusted rifles, a few Panzerfausts, and the last threads of hope. In March 1945, desperate for one last victory, Hitler launches Operation Spring Awakening near Lake Balaton in Hungary. It is the Wehrmacht's final offensive of the war, meant to protect the dwindling oil fields that keep his tanks alive, but the operation collapses almost instantly. Mud, exhaustion, and Soviet firepower crush the attack. The SS divisions that once spearheaded victory now crawl back in defeat. Even the generals who once worshipped him now see the truth. Hitler's orders no longer make sense. His maps are fantasies. His strategies, delusions. He is commanding an army that no longer exists. Beneath the ruined Reich chancellery, Hitler hides. The Führer bunker, a gray warren of concrete rooms, steel doors, and stale air, has become both his fortress and his tomb. Here, he spends his final weeks pacing between maps and madness. He is gaunt, shaking, eyes sunken and bloodshot. His speeches now ramble about betrayal, destiny, and vengeance. Eva Braun dances upstairs, trying to pretend the world isn't ending. Goebbels writes speeches no one will hear. Bormann plots escape routes that will never be used. Outside, the city burns. Inside, denial reigns. By April 16, 1945, the Red Army begins its final assault on Berlin. Over 2.5 million Soviet troops, thousands of tanks, and endless artillery bombard the capital. The ground shakes constantly. The night glows red with fire. German forces fight block by block, floor by floor. Each street becomes a graveyard. Each building is a fortress. In 1 week, the Soviets lose more men than the United States lost in the entire European campaign. But nothing stops them. They are fueled by vengeance. For Leningrad, for by April 28th, the city is encircled. The last radio messages from Berlin are filled with lies of victory and loyalty. Inside the bunker, Hitler marries Eva Braun. It is a wedding without music, flowers, or joy, only the scent of smoke and cyanide. 2 days later, on April 30th, 1945, he gathers his closest aides for a final goodbye. Outside, Soviet shells fall within meters of the bunker. He salutes his staff one last time. Then, in silence, he retires to his private room. Moments later, a single gunshot. Eva Braun follows with poison. The bodies are carried out into the courtyard, drenched in gasoline and burned. The flames rise briefly, flicker, and die. The man who plunged the world into darkness leaves nothing behind but ashes. When Soviet troops enter the chancellery, they find chaos, corpses, shattered furniture, and the smell of decay. The Reich has fallen. Goebbels, ever faithful to the end, poisons his wife and 6 children. Before taking his own life, Bormann vanishes into the ruins. The once terrifying Nazi hierarchy disintegrates in a haze of smoke and suicide. The red flag of the Soviet Union is raised over the Reichstag on May 2nd, 1945. Berlin is silent. Germany has surrendered in all but name on May 7th, 1945, in Reims, France. The German High Command signs an unconditional surrender to the Western Allies. The next day, another ceremony takes place in Berlin before the Soviets. World War II in Europe is over. Crowds erupt across the Allied world. Cheers in London, tears in Moscow, fireworks in New York. But amid the celebration lies an unspoken grief. 60 million souls have perished, entire cities have been erased, and the shadow of the Holocaust hangs over humanity like a scar that will never fade. The empire he promised would last 1,000 years did not survive 12. What remains are ruins, ashes, and graves. Germany lies divided between East and West. Europe is exhausted, wounded, forever changed. The Nuremberg trials will soon begin, an unprecedented reckoning. For the first time in history, leaders will be tried for crimes against humanity. The world will learn the names of Auschwitz, Treblinka, Dachau, names that will haunt history forever. From the rubble of the Reich, a new world emerges. The United Nations is formed to prevent such horror from ever returning. Nations rebuild. The Cold War begins, born from the ashes of Hitler's defeat. And yet, the lessons of that time, his arrogance, his obsession with control, his fatal belief in destiny, remain warnings for every generation. In the end, Adolf Hitler was not defeated merely by armies or bombs. He was defeated by his own madness, his own hubris, his own blindness to truth. Every empire built on hatred must one day collapse. Every lie, no matter how loudly shouted, is silenced by history, and every tyrant who believes himself invincible eventually meets the quiet judgment of time. The guns have fallen silent. Europe lies in ruins. But beneath the ash, something stirs. From the wreckage of cities and the weight of memory, a new world is being born. The death of Adolf Hitler marked not only the end of a war, it marked the beginning of an age defined by reckoning, reconstruction, and remembrance. The man who dreamed of conquering the world left behind only rubble, division, and grief. Yet from that devastation, humanity found purpose, an unshakable vow, never again. In November 1945, under the shattered ceilings of Nuremberg, the victors gather, not for vengeance, but for justice. 22 of the Third Reich's most powerful men stand in the dock: Göring, Hess, Ribbentrop, and others whose names once inspired fear. The charge: crimes against humanity. The evidence: mountains of film, testimony, and horror. For the first time in history, the world confronts the machinery of genocide. The Nazi system, built on lies, terror, and blind obedience, is exposed before the eyes of all nations. One by one, the architects of evil are condemned, some are hanged, others serve life behind bars, a few take their own lives before justice can be carried out. But the message is clear. There is no refuge in obedience. There is no defense in following orders. The age of moral neutrality is over. In the aftermath, Germany is carved into 4 zones of occupation: American, British, French, and Soviet Berlin. The city once at the heart of Hitler's empire is now split by ideology and iron. From the ashes of the Reich rise 2 nations: the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, aligned with democracy and capitalism, and the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, bound to Moscow's communist orbit. The world that Hitler tried to conquer has instead divided into 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, locked in a new kind of war, one of ideology, fear, and nuclear fire. It is the dawn of the Cold War, a conflict born not from Hitler's victory, but from his defeat. Yet amid the division, Europe begins to heal. With American support through the Marshall Plan, cities are rebuilt, economies revived. The factories of Germany hum once more, not for war, but for progress. By the 1950s, a new vision emerges, a Europe united not by conquest, but by cooperation. The seeds of the European Union are planted, nourished by the collective memory of war. From the pain of the past grows the promise of peace. For West Germany, democracy becomes redemption. For East Germany, the shadow of authoritarianism lingers until the Berlin Wall falls in 1989. And when it does, when that wall crumbles before the eyes of the world, Europe witnesses not destruction, but rebirth. The mistake that tore the continent apart now fuels its unity, but not all wounds heal easily. The Holocaust, Hitler's most monstrous legacy, remains an open scar on humanity's conscience. Across decades, survivors tell their stories. Museums, memorials, and films ensure that what was once hidden in silence is never forgotten again. In the decades that follow, Germany confronts its past with honesty rare in history. Through education, remembrance, and repentance, a nation once defined by evil becomes a guardian of memory. In this, perhaps, lies the greatest defeat of Hitler's ideology, that his vision of hate was buried not by bombs, but by truth. Hitler's mistakes reshaped the world far beyond Europe. His invasion of the Soviet Union created the foundation for the Cold War. His persecution of scientists drove intellectuals like Einstein, Fermi, and Oppenheimer to the West, where they helped build the atomic age. The war he began propelled the world into jet flight, radar, rocketry, and the dawn of computers. And in Asia, his alliance with Imperial Japan would help trigger the birth of new nations, India's independence, China's revolution, Korea's division, and the rise of the United States as a global superpower. The century that Hitler tried to control instead became defined by his failure. As the 21st century unfolds, the echoes of World War II continue to shape our world. The European Union expands eastward, embracing the nations once under Soviet rule. Germany becomes an engine of peace and democracy, a far cry from the tyranny it once embodied. But new challenges emerge: extremism, disinformation, nationalism, reborn through the screens of a digital age. Across continents, the same patterns of hatred and manipulation that once fueled Hitler's rise appear in new forms: online, amplified, and global. Historians, educators, and survivors warn, history does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And so, the memory of the Reich becomes more than history. It becomes a mirror, a reflection of what humanity must never allow again. In the years since 2020, the world has again been tested. Pandemics, economic instability, and geopolitical tension have reshaped the planet. The war in Ukraine reawakens the specter of aggression in Europe. Propaganda returns and history feels closer than ever. In classrooms, historians draw direct lines from Hitler's mistakes to modern crises: his contempt for diplomacy, his manipulation of truth, his weaponization of fear. But amid the danger, there is resilience. Technology that spreads lies can also preserve truth. Platforms that fuel division can also educate millions. And voices, once silenced, can now reach the world. The legacy of World War II is not only the cost of evil, it is the power of remembrance. Adolf Hitler believed his empire would last 1,000 years. It ended in 12. But the lessons of his failure, his fatal mistakes, still echo in the corridors of power, in the screens of our time, and in the conscience of humanity. We study him not to glorify, but to understand, not to remember his power, but to remember his collapse. For every dictatorship that rises, every lie that spreads, every hatred that burns, there stands the memory of what came before. In the end, the greatest victory over Hitler was not on the battlefield. It was the rebirth of freedom, the endurance of truth, and the unbroken will of humankind to rise from darkness. Because history is not just what we inherit, it is what we choose to remember.